Hey Patricia, it's Dee Dee, Diane of LiveLifeChange.com. I want to say thank you for joining us today in this conversation for our compassionate connectors. I'd like to introduce you a little bit. One of the reasons why I reached out to you is because I know that you work with the HSP population, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself.
Hi, Dee Dee. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here. My name is Patricia Young. I live in San Diego, California. I have a private practice, and I work with highly sensitive people. I help them with the strong responses that we have as HSPs, help them get a little bit more balance in their lives, help them understand what their strengths are, because often the weaknesses that we think are really our greatest strengths. I also help people with chronic illness and aging, ADHD. I work with a lot of women in relationship issues.
Wow, that's amazing. I love that. Um, that a good focus of what you do is with the HSP. For those people who don't know what HSP is, can you take a minute and tell us a little bit about that?
Highly sensitive person is a term that was coined by Dr. Elaine Aron, and it relates to four main characteristics she calls DOEs, which is D for depth of processing. We're deep thinkers. I always screw this up, and I didn't know we were going to talk about it, so I'm like, where's my little cheat sheet? O, if I recall, is overstimulation and being over-aroused. E is emotional responsiveness and empathy, and S is sensory processing sensitivity. So basically, we think and feel things very deeply. We pick up on all kinds of things in the environment. It's not uncommon for us to have a higher emotional response to things. It's harder to shake things off. We're aware and sensitive to lights and sounds and noises and crowds. About 30% of HSPs are extroverts, 70% are introverts, and men and women are equally affected by HSP. It's an inborn trait. So it's not something that happens as a result of trauma. It's kind of how we come wired. And often the negative imaging or messaging that we get is, you're too sensitive, you think too much, you overanalyze, you can't take a joke. But our culture is really set up in a way that doesn't value sensitivity. And I was actually listening to, sorry, I feel like I'm going off on a tangent.
No,
I'm on
that's
my
okay. No, it's awesome.
HSP soapbox. I was listening to a podcast by Ted Zeff, who also does a lot of work with HSPs, and he was saying he really wishes that the term had been coined sensory processing sensitivity, because in our culture, sensitivity has such a negative connotation. It does in Canada. They've done cross-cultural studies. In China and Thailand, sensitivity is seen as a strength. Here in the States and in Canada, not so much.
Yeah, I do agree. I do agree with that. I remember growing up, people saying, "Oh, you're so sensitive," or "You're highly sensitive," and it always came across as something yucky. And in fact, I think it was, I don't know, maybe a couple months ago, where I also was listening to a podcast, and it was Lourdes Viado's podcast with, I think it was April Snow, talking about HSP, and then I started listening to some of your Facebook lives, and I decided, let me check on this actual HSP scale. And when I took the little questionnaire, I ranked 24 out of 27. I was like, why didn't I know that? I mean, innately, I think we all kind of have that intuition that we're able to be empathic, and we have a gift that a lot of people don't understand or know. Like when people ask me about how I work with complicated and pervasive grief, and how do I know to distinguish the difference between, pathological disorder and grief, and when to diagnose it. For me, it's a knowing. It's not something like, this happened, check. This happened, check. This happened, check.
Right.
Like the DSM teaches us to do, right? So I was intrigued by that. And then when I took the scale, I was like, okay, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? I'm not overly introverted, not overly extroverted. I'm kind of like right there, smack in the middle. But I also believe that a lot of it has to do with, as we're growing and we feel our way through, that we start learning how to set the boundaries and start learning how to be acceptant
Right.
of our superpowers. I call them superpowers.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so I'm interested, when did you decide to work with this population?
It's been pretty recently. It's so funny. You would think that I would remember when I learned about being an HSP, and I don't know. And it's probably only been within the last maybe year and a half.
Mhm.
And I can't even tell you. Somebody may have just said, "Have you checked out if you're an HSP?" And it's interesting. As a clinician, I hate the fact that we have to diagnose. I'm not into labels. I'm not into pathologizing. But once I found out I was an HSP, I really have embraced it and ran with it, because it's helped me to look back over my life and almost have a different narrative. And because HSPs make up about 20% of the population, we're in the minority. So not only do we get the messaging that who we are isn't okay, there's usually just a pretty small portion of us. And so once I learned about the traits of being an HSP and kind of looked over my life, it totally made sense. And I've really been able to reframe an awful lot of what I thought was like anxiety or like social anxiety, depression. A lot of those things really is about being over aroused, overstimulated, needing time to retreat and withdraw. And I think it's really common for people who don't know that they're HSPs to feel like, what's wrong with me? How come everybody else can go out and do these crowds and busy, 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 doing, and like I can take a little bit and then I need to retreat, and feeling like there must be something wrong with me. So I'm incredibly passionate. I feel like I suffered and struggled for so many years feeling like there was something wrong with me. I just want to get the word out so that like you have great strengths. We're the healers and the teachers and the creators. Without the HSPs, the world would not have, the vision and the things that we see that non-HSPs don't.
I wholeheartedly agree with what you're saying. And I think that being an HSP, I also understand that if I'm in an environment that I'm not well grounded, or that I haven't kind of done some kind of protective ritual for myself, right? Whether that is my meditation or my prayer or setting the intention for what it is that I'm going to be doing for the day, that if I don't do that, I feel emotionally drained to a level of exhaustion. And
Yeah.
personally, I struggle with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. So I am super sensitive and aware of the things that trigger that. And because of that, part of my self-care has that routine of being able to, okay, I know what I'm going into, and just kind of getting really centered and focused. And I find that in grief work, when I'm working with those individuals who are kind of stalled, who are kind of stuck in the process, who are either delayed in their grief or are having some kind of challenge with their grief, that a good majority of the people, if are highly sensitive. It's a highly sensitive population. Now, I haven't done the research, and it intrigues me. I'm wondering if there's statistics, and I'm not asking you, I'm just kind of talking out loud, but my curiosity is piqued, wondering if there's the statistics of HSPs and how we deal with grief, right? Or if grief then kind of triggers those HSP traits, if they're not heightened.
Well,
Right.
about 50% of the people that are in therapy are HSPs. So if you have an HSP that grows up with well-attuned caregivers and parents, they end up not really having very many issues. They may not even know that they're HSPs because they just learn to adapt. If they grow up with what Elaine Aron calls difficult, if they have difficult childhoods, there's a higher incidence of anxiety and depression. But there's something called differential susceptibility, which means that given a positive, nurturing environment, HSPs do much better than non-HSPs. And so as clinicians, what that means for us is we need to provide a lot of validation, normalizing positive regard. Those are the things that are going to help our HSP clients really flourish. That we have other non-HSP clients where we may need to be more confrontive, we may need to bring up inconsistencies. Our HSPs are so finely tuned they know when they're screwing up and they're probably beating up on themselves. And I, I heard your question about grief. This is off the top of my head. I have nothing to substantiate this, but I'm wondering if, because we feel things so deeply, that grief can be very, very overwhelming,
Yeah.
that helping to create ways to experience and feel some of the grief, and then ways to kind of get out of it so that they can kind of deal with it in manageable bits, because we tend to get overwhelmed and overstimulated and over aroused just with daily activities. So I'm imagining that with grief, that's just going to feel like a flooding if the HSP doesn't know how to, I want to use the word self-regulate, but I'm trying to think of a more, if the HSP doesn't have a good way to kind of get calming and soothing if they start feeling overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that in grief, that is one thing. I mean, even if you were an HSP, your emotions. I usually tell my clients that everything that we think is abnormal becomes normal in grief, really, because first of all, what is normal, right? I had a client who bought me a coffee mug, and it says, around here, normal is just a dryer setting. So
I
that
love that.
that sense of humor when we're talking about grief. But the other piece of that is that when we are in grief, everything that is said or isn't said rubs us wrong. It is very overwhelming, because there's so many different things, so many presenting factors when we're talking about grief in itself, that we're kind of like in crisis mode. you know and what I love about what I do is that I'm able to show those who come seeking support that they already innately have the skills to be able to deal with this existential crisis. It's just that when we're in crisis, we tend to forget that we have those skills, you know, because we don't use them in crisis mode all the time. We don't practice them. So it's a matter of kind of getting them back on track. So what is, how does grief present in your practice, and the things that you do? I know I heard you say that you help chronic illness and seniors, aging population, and just a myriad of other individuals. So, what does that look like for you in your practice?
I think even from the mildest forms, almost anybody that's coming to therapy is there due to generally some type of grief, although I don't think that we think about this as therapists, because it means that there's something that they're wanting that they don't have, and so there's already a loss. So I think even in terms of relationships, marriages that don't work out, there's grief and loss because you had this dream of what you thought it was going to be like, and now it's not turning out that way. So I think that when people think of grief, they think strictly in terms of death, but it's health issues, it's launching kids to college, it's having a chronic illness, it's having a short-term illness. Anytime that we kind of lose what our normal is, I think that there's grief involved. And what you were talking about, I've heard two analogies, and I tend to mix them up when I talk about it, and it makes it very unclear. But it's almost like before we have a grief or loss, we're in a rhythm. We may not appreciate it or like it, but we're not really thinking very much about the day-to-day function. And we may be thinking about how our life isn't so great. But once we have a loss or something that really happens, it catapults us into this new area where we're not where we used to be, we're not where we're heading. We feel like a big raw nerve, and it's kind of like being in this long tunnel and there's no light. It's the messy middle. You don't know where you're heading, you're not where you used to be, and it's really, really, really uncomfortable. And then you just long to go back to whatever was known and familiar, even if it was crappy. At least it was stable and you knew where you were at.
It was comfortable. It really was
I
comfortable.
think I say familiar. I don't even know if it's always comfortable, but
Yeah.
I think familiar.
Yeah, that's actually, I like that reframe as well. I think, and that was the concept behind my DBA, the name of my business, Live Life Change, because grief changes us. It changes us to the core. It's also one of the reasons why I use the butterfly so much as a metaphor, because before that caterpillar turns into a butterfly, it literally has to metamorphose out of its existing state of being. It has to bust through its skin to create the cocoon, to be in darkness, to grow through that, and then be able to, change into something that is different, more graceful. You watch a butterfly. Well, some butterflies aren't very graceful. They're a little bit ADHD, but that symbolism of how these things kind of progress naturally, and I don't know if you've ever seen the seed or the egg of a butterfly. It is so tiny that it's hard to even believe that a creature of that size can come from something that's the size of of a pinhead. It's kind of is that tiny. And then, the way that it just progresses is, I don't know, for me, it's a beautiful transformation, a beautiful transition.
And they have to fight their way out of the chrysalis. If you open up the chrysalis, that they're not going to live, that they need to have that fighting and the pushing and the pulling in order to survive.
Yes, and it can't be rushed. You cannot rush it. It has to be within its own time.
Right. And then I didn't talk about the obvious grief that I deal with. I've had a couple clients that have had partners that have committed suicide. I've had people that are undergoing treatment for cancer, so they're either undergoing radiation or chemotherapy. A couple of people with fibromyalgia, Parkinson's, so watching the decline that they have, Alzheimer's. So those are all areas of loss. And also caregiving. If you're providing caregiving to someone who either has Alzheimer's or has a chronic illness, there's the loss of the relationship and the independence that you had and the shift in the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, I remember my very first death experience was early on at the age of 4. And I really believe that that was how the universe was preparing me to do the work that I'm doing today. And I've done the hospice volunteer work. I've done the 11th hour. I had a child who had cancer, and I had a child who died from cancer. So I know that whole process of that. I have another child with special needs. So the grieving process of so many different things, change relationship, empty nesting. My youngest is 15, my oldest is 29. I have one who's at home, one who's in California, and then I have another one who's on the other side of the world deployed at this moment. So as a mom, right, as a mama, I think there's a lot of grief in that alone. But then when you see it come into your practice, you can kind of relate to how the loss process can be a lot of losses, and they don't have to be to the expanse of death, dying, and bereavement, but the steps or the familiarity can be the same.
Yeah.
So what one thing do you wish other therapists knew about the population that you serve, if you had to just tell them something?
In terms of grief or just in general?
In general, yeah.
I think the main thing is it's going back to that differential susceptibility, that your HSP clients are often going to be perfectionistic. They're really hard on themselves. They have an internal narrative usually that is very inconsistent with what you see, how they present. And so it's really about doing a lot of strength building, education, validating, normalizing, really helping them to see the gifts and the strengths that they have, to do a lot of reframing. I also find that a lot of it's not uncommon for HSPs to either have parents or to pair up with narcissists, because it's a great match, because the HSP is so sensitive to the other person's needs and they kind of get that sense of connection, but it ends up being really to the detriment of the HSP. Mm-hmm. So the HSPs take on a lot of negative talk from their partners, because that's how their partners manage their sense of self-esteem, is by making the HSP wrong. And then the HSP takes it on and believes that it's correct. And so really doing a lot of, it's not really mirroring, but talking about what healthy relationships look like, the balance in relationships, and helping HSPs, if they are taking on stuff that's not theirs, to help them understand why that comes about, because HSPs have so much to offer, and we often have been kind of so marginalized, and then we marginalize ourselves, that we really don't have this sense of like, I've got all these great things to offer. And the HSPs need to learn about being an HSP. They need to hang out with other HSPs, because that's, I think, where you start getting that strength and the, like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one. There are lots of other people
Yeah.
like me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, since you said that about HSPs, being more susceptible to being in narcissistic partnerships and relationships, how that works intergenerationally. Because I know earlier in our conversation, you had said, your parenting, um, HSPs can, I don't know, present one way with parenting that is attuned to their emotional intelligence or their needs, and then how does that work for the HSPs whose parents are more critical, more opinionated, um, and who could possibly have some of those narcissistic traits and tendencies, right?
Right. Um, Judy, I have to be totally transparent with you. I screwed up on a podcast, and because this is a new area for me, like, I know about my experience being an HSP, but every time I venture out with how I put information together, and Dr. Elaine Aron said one of the great things about HSPs is this: we take in so much information, we often can come up with new ideas based on what is out there. But I always have this chatter in the back of my head, like I want to say something like, what if I say it and like I'm really wrong and I make an assumption? And so I just want to own, like, I make mistakes. I'm doing the best job that I can. But here's what I think happens is when we grow up, I'm trying to think if this is valid for HSPs and non-HSPs. I'm going to stick with HSPs. That's what I know. So we get negative messaging. We're to this, we're to that. We take it on. And then we feel like, who's going to love us? Because we're unlovable, because we've been told that we're all of these things. And then we finally find somebody who loves us, and that we kind of are so into the fact that somebody wants us that we don't come from a place of, I have a lot of great things to offer, and these are the things that I need in a relationship. These are the things that are deal breakers. For women too, we get so, I mean, look at Beauty and the Beast. Love the beast and you'll tame him. Look at Little Mermaid. I think these messages are so powerful. And I can tell you, I'm on my second marriage now. We've been married 21 years. My first marriage, I thought my love would heal him.
Yeah.
It didn't work. And, I was so into finding someone who would just love me. And after getting divorced and having lots of therapy, I got really clear on what are the things that I want in a partner, what are the things that are deal breakers, what do I have to offer. But for any of us, when we come from a place of wounding and feeling like we're not enough, it really makes it harder to make adult choices in our partners because of our own wounding and our sense of what we have or don't have to offer.
Oh, that is so powerful. As I hear you saying those things, what came up for me was, we're taught as HSPs that our needs are not valuable, right? And if we choose us first, that we're somehow selfish. And people tease me when I say this, so it's okay. I'll take the teasing. I woke up one day many, many years ago. I was a dependent wife. My husband did 20 plus years in the military. I'm a Blue Star mom and a Gold Star cousin. So military life is a really big, and first responders is a really big thing in my family generationally. Okay, so we have preachers and EMS people and all this stuff, but I remember one day waking up and I was a very angry individual. Angry mama, angry wife, angry anything. Everything out of my mouth was curse words. I was like, thank you, Lord, that I'm not going to hell now because I've tamed that monster. But what I recognized was during that period of ebbs and flows of grief and trying to understand who I was, back then Oprah had in her TV show, she had a little small segment at the end of her program that was something called like honoring the spirit or something like that. I don't remember. But it was a time of reflection at the end of the show. And it was always about, things that you could do to center yourself, things that you could do to give yourself permission to take time for you. So I say Oprah changed my life because she taught me that I could be selfish and it didn't have to be something negative, that I could go to the bathroom without the kid attached to my side, while I'm trying to take a shower or brush my teeth and cleaning their nose or whatever. So I think that right there, what you said, resonated so deeply for me because um, we do tend to compromise a lot on what our needs are because we want to help so much that we end up sometimes going bankrupt, pouring from that empty cup. And that leaves us depleted. It leaves us angry. It leaves us exhausted, fatigued, and not in such a great place. I don't
And
know.
we're validated for it. We're so polite, we're so calm, we're so caring, we're so giving, you're, nice. And
You're
it's
so
like,
strong.
yeah, yeah, and that we learn how to manage everybody else's needs except for our own, and that the women who take care of themselves and stand up. There was a video on Facebook recently about being called, can we swear on this?
Yeah, I don't care.
Um,
We're all
just,
adults.
just checking. About what it means if you're called a bitch. And this woman was saying it's a good thing because it means that you have a voice and you're standing up for yourself. And people don't like when women do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's something to be said for that, they want us to be nice, be nice ladies.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck that shit.
Yeah, no, and you know what? And the funny thing about that too is that when you begin to empower yourself and when you begin to set those boundaries and when you begin to really discover that it's okay for you to take care of yourself first because you can't take care of others or effectively if you don't, that, you get a lot of pushback. You get a
Mm-hmm.
lot of pushback from the people who you've given your all to. They don't
Because
understand.
they're not getting stuff from you anymore. The only people
Yeah,
that don't like you setting boundaries are the ones that aren't getting stuff from
yeah.
you.
Well, and I think that was a big thing for me because when I started that journey, I'm gonna say 25, 26 years ago, right? The piece for me was I was a huge people pleaser.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be up to here with doing things and activities for the kids and managing when my husband was deployed or gone on a temporary duty and running the household and working two jobs and doing this, that, and whatever. And my neighbor or my friend or my best friend would say, "Hey, I need to go to the grocery store. Can you watch the kids?" And I'm like literally pulling my hairs out, trying to, as an A-type personality, everything was in some kind of order, that I seriously didn't even have time to breathe, and realizing that saying no, period, without nothing behind it, was really, really difficult for me. And even saying no with like a book behind the no of why I'm saying no felt really yucky, shameful, guilty. I felt like I was the scum of the earth,
Yeah.
So it's interesting how those things come up.
And I think for HSPs too, because we tend to not like conflict and we want to have peace, that we have a harder time voicing when we're unhappy and things aren't going well. I find with many of the HSPs that I work with that it's really hard to, voice what they're not happy with and to have conflict.
I have actually had people. I actually had somebody very near and dear to me in one of my most difficult moments. Um, Word vomit some hurts that they were feeling that day because of some action or another. And after they did that, the words that came out of their mouth was, "I'm saying this to you because I know that you are a forgiving person and this is a healing process for me." And um, what wanted to come out of my mouth, and I'm not sure if I said it or I thought it, but it was like, "I'm so effing glad that you can heal at my expense." But the response for me was, I was angry. I was like, yeah, just because I'm kind, just because I weigh what comes out of my mouth. Just because I sit with what's coming up for me first before I respond to you in anger, and I don't go for the jugular, doesn't mean that you get to do that to me and then, be okay with it, because I'm going to forgive you.
Yep.
Because that I'm a forgiving spirit, that still kind of sits with me. It sits wrong with me.
Well, I had somebody do this to me when I was in my 20s, and I've seen the pattern since. People who don't manage their emotions, they build up, they build up, they build up, and then they blow.
Mm-hmm.
And so they word vomit on you, or they tell you everything. They feel better because this pressure valve has been released,
Mm-hmm.
but then they dump on us, and that stuff sits with us. Once it's out of your mouth, it really stays. And that is not how we effectively and healthfully manage our discomfort. But people that do it say, like, I feel so much better because the pressure gauge is off. But that is not an effective way to manage relationships that you care about or people that you care about. And I'm sorry that happened to you. It stinks when somebody kind of emotionally barfs all over you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do think I even as you're explaining it, I have that image of like toxic gook,
Yeah.
how it's acidic, how it eats away at you at a slow pace, and really can be a deep wound for many people. And I find that when we're talking about grief, that a lot of times, those who are barfing information on others, or saying things, is really because they feel so uncomfortable, and it's about what they're feeling, that they tend to forget how to compassion other people who are in the grief at that moment, and so they lose sight of that. So, what kind of continuing education have you found helpful for you? I'm not even sure if this is something that you've are digging into deeper, or that you've already kind of looked into, so that you can kind of give a point of reference to anybody who might be listening today.
Well, I want to go back to what we were just talking about. Is it okay to go back to
Oh,
that?
sure, absolutely.
For those of us that are over 40, 50, we're enjoying our middle years.
I am not claiming anything.
I'm just speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for you. There used to be a game called Hot Potato, and it was a plastic red potato that you'd wind up and you'd have to toss it around in a circle, and the goal was to not have it, go off and buzz when someone was holding it. And I think I read this somewhere. I would love to take credit for this, but I don't think that I can. You know how you absorb stuff and you don't know where it comes from?
Yeah.
But I talk about the hot potato as the emotional hot potato. Like, I have a kid who's really impulsive and reacts very quickly. And so, like, he gets these uncomfortable feelings. He's like, I don't want to hold it. And he throws it at me. And so it's easy to get reactive as a parent and to pick that up. And now I've got the uncomfortable feelings. And so, I think especially as an HSP, because we have strong responses to things, we feel things deeply. And what you were talking about with the person that, kind of let their stuff off on you, that we take things on and we take it to heart. I hear HSPs talk a lot about ruminating. And I'm really conscious about the languaging that we use. And I don't like to use the word ruminating because it has a negative connotation.
Mm-hmm.
That we think deeply about things and we process things. And yes, if you call us a name or you say something unkind, chances are it's going to stick with us. It's not going to dissipate really quickly. And I see this kind of emotional hot potato going on. It's very common in relationships that I'm not comfortable with what I'm feeling, instead of saying, like, I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling reactive. It's like, well, you're just being impatient, or you're just being, when we put it on somebody else. So
yeah, accusatory in a sense. And I think, and what you were saying, I can totally relate to that, because I feel like when someone says things that are hurtful to me, I can be forgiving, and I can process that and not hold on to that. But it goes in that little file cabinet in the back of my head of kind of like a small warning. Remember that this happened. And I know, again, we go back to Oprah, because I just love Oprah. Oprah's mentor, Maya Angelou, used to say, when people show you their colors the first time, believe them.
Yeah.
because that behavior is going to come out again and again and again. And so I think as a HSP, and that particular moment in my life was right after my son died. Like
Mm,
literally 24 hours into the death of my son was when that conversation happened. And
yeah.
what a moment to have something like that dumped on you when you are an HSP, when you are a grieving mother, and when you haven't even had 24 hours to process what was going on. And I get that that's an emotional charge time for everybody who was involved around me during that time period. So the logical part of me understands that, but the emotional and HSP part of me is like, that was not okay. And
Yeah.
that should never happen to anybody else. And if nothing else, sharing that piece of the story, that insensitivity, from that very moment is part of what I feel called to do when I'm educating and empowering and advocating for grief.
Hmm. Grief brings up such intense feelings for other people, and that they can't manage their own feelings. And so it's not uncommon for, if you're grieving and the people around you say incredibly insensitive things because they're not comfortable sitting with the intensity of the grief or the pain or the sorrow, or imagining what it would be like for them. Like, a true confession to you, one area I've not gotten close to is dealing with the loss of a child,
Mhm.
because I have kids. Like, for me, I think that would wreck me. So I have a boundary up. I mean, I can be compassionate with you, but there's a part of me like, I don't really want to go exploring there. I can go exploring a lot of other places with grief. That's one that's just too tender for me.
Yeah.
But I know that and I own it. So I'm really clear that I can be with you and be present to a certain degree, but I'm certainly not going to put my bias on you. But grief really brings up uncomfortable things for other people. And they say the most incredibly insensitive things for whatever reason they do.
Yeah, there is a lot of vulnerability, and I do recall losing a lot of friendships even after the years. I mean, just recently somebody posted something on Facebook, took a picture out of my Facebook page, and it was a friend from high school, and it was so hurtful that I was just like, okay, you did it. I accept your apology. That's okay. However, I'm not going to allow myself to get put in that situation again. So I'm putting this boundary in place now. Because for me, a lot of times it's not a problem until it's a problem.
Yeah, yeah.
Even though I'm very proactive with a lot of the things that I do. But, I feel like, um, that's part of who we need to be when we're having this conversation. If you're not comfortable talking about death, dying, and bereavement, or the loss of a child, then that's exactly what needs to be said. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not comfortable. I want to support you. I just don't know how to because of my own things. You know,
Right.
and I feel like that is more helpful for the bereaved when you
Mm-hmm.
say something like that than changing the subject, cutting the conversation, you know, um, things that can be a lot more um, soul wounding
Yeah.
with verbal or nonverbal cues. Because let me
Mm-hmm.
tell you, when you're in grief, I always tell people that your bullshit meter is really high. You can
Mm-hmm.
you can see who is coming a mile away, and you know who's being transparent and supportive, and who's wanting something, or who is uncomfortable. You get sensitive to all that. You become sensitive to all that. So
It's really an opportunity to, did I cut you off?
no, you're good.
It really gives you an opportunity to see who has the capacity to be with intense feelings and to be with discomfort. And just a lot of people, they don't know how to do it, they haven't experienced it, and so it brings up something for them that they just don't even have the capacity to show up, and they don't even have the ability to say, like, I don't even know what to say. And so I think that is really a litmus test. I also want to acknowledge, you asked me about any resources or continuing education for grief. I got nothing for you. So even though I glossed over it, I want to acknowledge that I'm glossing over it.
What What about HSP? Since you are going into that and into discovering more about that, and you're getting more well versed into that, any places where people can go and find more information?
Tons, tons. Dr. Elaine Aron has a bunch of books. Ted Zeff, Zeff, especially if you have children or you've got boys, he's really focused on the strong, sensitive male. There
Mm.
are a number of really good podcasts out there. There's one, it's not being currently produced, but it's called, I think it's Highly Sensitive Person. Susan Cain has a podcast called Quiet, the Power of Introverts.
Mm.
She lumps highly sensitive introverts with her introverts. So, I'm kind of a stickler about, providing accurate information, but I'm not going to go into that. But I listened to the whole series of her podcasts. So you just have to be pretty mindful. I also, on my website, I have a bunch of videos, and then I have a YouTube channel that has even more things that aren't always relevant to my website. So before we end, I'm happy to give that, because being an HSP shows up with communication, with conflict, with expecting friends to be a certain way, being in a new situation and feeling like people aren't giving us a chance to talk. For me, I had something come up. My husband wanted to go out and do something, and I'm like, oh, it's a little too people-y. So those things come up for us, all over the place, and I'm really trying to get out information. I've also, I feel like I'm doing a little self-promotion. I know it's okay, but there's a part of me that feels like, I shouldn't
Yeah.
do it. I had something recently where I thought I had social anxiety all my life, and now looking at it through the eyes of an HSP, I think I got over-aroused and overstimulated, and that with the narrative of like, I have nothing to say, and then I'd go to an event and talk to somebody who also was uncomfortable, so the conversation didn't go anywhere. And
Yeah.
then I just reinforced the fact that I must be a loser. And so I had an opportunity to go to a social event recently, got really anxious and processed through it, and had a very different experience with this, like, oh, it was the overwhelm and over anxiety that got triggered in my body, and it made me not want to go back and do it. And I think that happens a lot for HSPs, that something happens and our body gets so aroused that we just don't want to go back in it, and we incorrectly label what happened. And then we kind of miss out on a bunch of stuff because we don't know that if we can figure out how to manage the over arousability, we can do a lot more.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, because I know that sometimes it can kind of paralyze us, right? That perfectionism or that need of knowing, or I think there's been plenty of times where worry has been mislabeled for me with anxiety,
Sure,
and just
sure.
it's more about that, I'm not sitting long enough with what is coming at me for me to be able to discern exactly what it is that's presenting. So, I know that when I work with clients, I have rituals that I tend to do. Like in my private practice, when I was seeing clients for the mental health piece, I intentionally did not make my appointments back to back. I would always have like 15 minutes in between. With some clients, I knew that the sessions were going to be heavy. So there were times that we would do um, guided meditation together, or, diffusing essential oils for emotional support that added grounding. I'm wondering for you, what kind of practices, what kind of rituals do you have to help prepare you for the day, and to help close out the day before you leave your clients at work?
I knew we were going to talk about this, and it's like, okay, here's the truth. I had a period where I was, exercising and going to the gym and going to yoga regularly and eating really healthy, and like everything was on a roll. And I did that for about 2 years. And recently, not so much,
Yeah.
and so I recognize that things are out of balance, and there's been a lot of transitions, and I'm just kind of going with it. So I have this idea of self-care is supposed to look like this, and like right now it's about like this. And so much of what we all need is radical self-compassion. That,
Mhm.
If I'm not getting up at 4:30 in the morning and going to the gym, and I'm not, lifting weights at 4:30 in the morning, and I'm not eating healthy all the time, but what I can do, I've got to be okay with. I really have to be okay with it, and embrace that, because beating myself up isn't going to get anything done, and it's probably going to make me resist and do even more things that don't work. So I definitely have to get enough sleep. There are only so many clients that work for me to see during the day. I put breaks in between my clients. She's always on my lap. This is little Gracie, my
Oh,
little one-eyed
hi,
wonder.
Gracie.
So she is almost always on my lap for two reasons. That if she's with me, then she won't be at the door barking, and she won't be on the floor scratching, where then you hear the thump, 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 thump. She's also blind, so she likes to be close to me because she feels secure.
Yeah.
Um, I tend to be
She's
kind of
part
a
of yourself.
fly. What's that?
She's part of your self-care.
It's
Yeah.
kind of a mutual thing. I'm not sure who needs who a little bit more. I tend to be more of a fly by the seat of your pants type of person. I like to be prepared and organized, but I'm not really consistent about doing the same things every day. But like, I need to have quiet. I need to have times where I listen to podcasts because my head tends to be busy and it tends to not go to naturally positive things. I have to make a conscious choice to fill what I'm consuming is positive. I don't watch the news. I am very mindful about what I listen to. I feel like I sort of answered your question, kind of, sort of, but not
Yeah, well,
exactly.
no, I mean that's how you work with, that's the way that you do things. I think I do that as well. I try to have items in my toolbox, but I also allow it to organically unfold. I mean, sometimes, I remember when so part of the grief work that I did with couples was infidelity and affair recovery or any kind of betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember there was this one couple. Actually, I had two of these couples. Now that I think about it, but one couple where the wife was extremely narcissistic in nature, and I could feel a lot of stuff coming up for me, you know, before the sessions and after the sessions. I'm pretty good about compartmentalizing. Um, but man, at one point in the beginning, they were my last couple of the day. And I was like, I don't want my day to end like this. So I moved them to be like the first couple of the day. And then I was like, oh, hell no, I don't want my day to start like this. I am not bookending my work with this couple. Um, and I ended up having to be pretty confrontational with the spouse because, as it's a constant challenge. And it was like, well, you came here for this. This is what I'm giving you. I understand you don't like it. But at the end of the day, so what I ended up doing was putting them towards the middle. And then when things were not working, part of my clause, part of my boundaries when I do an intake with a couple is I'm never going to be working harder than you are with any of my clients. I'm never going to
Yeah.
be working harder than you are. And if at any point I feel like I'm not the best person for you, or you feel that I'm not the best person for you in your next step, then we just terminate it. It's no hard feelings, because at the end of the day, what I really want is that person to get the help that they need, whether it's from me or somebody else. I don't care. Yeah, it's nice to get the paycheck, right? We like that. But I found that with this particular couple, part of my self-care was there was one hard rock, and I don't listen to a lot of hard rock, but there was this one hard rock song that I would turn on and just let like blare
Check it
in my
out.
head and let it all come out. And by the time the song was finished, I was good. I was golden. I could
Yeah.
move on to the next client, to the next case, to the next heavy, to the next, growth, whatever it was that was coming. But that was part of my self-care. Now, did I do that with every client? No, it wasn't. Sometimes it was, if it was a really hard day, I did that mental thing. As I walk out the door, I'm leaving it in the office. I close this door, it stays in the office. If there's a residual piece, then as I'm walking down the hallway, I'm leaving pieces behind. As I walk out the building door, I'm leaving another chunk behind. As I get into the elevator and come down, there's another one. So I have these visual letting go rituals so that have different stages to be able to leave that before it comes home, and ultimately by the time I walk in through my front doors, then I have processed enough to say, no, the front door is the ultimate cutoff. If I need to, I'll pick it up back in the morning or when I walk back out that way.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important thing is, part of honoring who we are and part of our self-care is listening to what makes sense to us in that moment. Sometimes
Yeah.
it's the season of getting up and exercising. Not me.
Yeah. I just heard something really great too, that if you're, bringing home stuff with your clients, you can actually get a container and write down what's bugging you, and you keep the container literally outside of your house so that, there's a box that contains it that's literally outside your house if you feel like you're taking home stuff that, you don't
Yeah.
want to bring to your home.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So, okay, I'm a grief girl. I mean, I'm a quote girl. I mean, yes, I'm a grief girl, but I'm a quote girl
okay.
too. Do you have, are you a quote girl? Do you
I
like,
am not
you're not? Okay. So, how about we do this? How about, finish the sentence?
okay.
Grief is
A bitch.
a bitch. The biggest myth with grief is,
That you can process through it and get over it in a specific amount of time.
oh yes, absolutely. Grieving can,
There's something about, I also worked for hospice. I worked in an acute care hospital for 9 years, everything from the ER to the ICU to labor and delivery. So I saw a lot of expected and unexpected death. I worked for home health. There is something that can be incredibly touching and spiritual
mm-hmm.
when someone is in the grief process and they allow you to enter it with them.
Yes.
That there's such presence there, and you really get to experience something with people that you don't normally get to experience on a daily basis. And as painful and uncomfortable as it is, there's something about this happens with grief, but this kind of goes like, if I were going to have a quote, it's the same thing, that when we allow people to join us in whatever we're going through, and we're in an imperfect, not polished moment, there's such power and healing that happens there. And outside of grief, we kind of want to have our armor on and be very together and I'm fine and everything's good. And when we have people that are safe and we allow them to be with us when we're struggling and we don't have the answers, there is such a powerful connection that happens. And in that, allowing people to see us when we don't feel put together and to enter our world, so incredibly healing. And that's the same thing that happens in grief.
Yes, I do believe that. I often think that grief can be transformational,
Mm-hmm.
and having done years of hospice work, which is, people usually say, how did you get into this? And most of it was driven by my own personal passion and my own exposure culturally to death, dying, and bereavement. And within my own family, the many, many losses that we've had. But I remember that when I was doing volunteer work and I was doing 11th hour, which is that period of, somebody is transitioning, providing relief for the family members, because family members don't want to let their loved ones die alone, right? And in my own experience of not wanting to ever leave my son's bedside, not even to go to the bathroom. I mean, if I could have worn an adult diaper, I would have.
Sure.
But knowing that there was somebody there, and I remember people saying, how do you do that? How do you volunteer to end up doing that? And for me, it was incredibly fulfilling.
Mm-hmm.
People might want to think that was kind of altruistic, but it wasn't. I gained more than what I gave. And a lot of people are like, it just sounds morbid. It sounds horrible to just have to sit with that and know that somebody is dying in your presence. And so the flip side for that for me was, the witnessing, the comfort, the companioning, which is why I called the group Compassionate Connectors. The companioning piece, like you're saying, is so very powerful. It's so very transformational that connects us on a very basic and human level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, did you want to share anything else that we haven't covered?
I'm looking over my notes. The other thing about death is that depending on what your beliefs are about death and what happens after death, it's so easy to look at it as the loss of a person from your life. And it's a huge thing. That, I mean, I'm not dismissing that. But I think that we forget about the presence and the connection, and depending on what your beliefs are, the spirituality, that it really can be in a time of incredibly deep connection and healing, talking about regrets, things that we normally don't talk about, but it can be an incredibly healing and powerful time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons that I came up with the Mindful Grieving Journal um, that I have shared with clients, and I mean, people order it all the time off of my website, was because it allowed for that exactly what you're talking about. The witnessing piece, whether somebody's witnessing it with them or just even the processing piece of, talking about the grief piece, kind of, um, I don't know, giving it words. Sometimes we don't get the validation that we need from our fellow support system. Sometimes our support system gets compassion fatigue, you know. It could be our very own partners. In my case, my husband grieved totally different than I did when, I was the one who allowed myself to cry and, be upset and do whatever during that time period, where his grief was more situational.
Mm-hmm.
A good part of it had been kind of compartmentalized and put aside. But being able to have a safe place within my sacred circle, because that's usually where we get injured and wounded the most, right? Being able to journal about that gave me that freedom of not feeling like I was a burden to somebody else, and sharing if I wanted to share it with someone else. Just saying, I don't have the words to say it out loud, but I can put it to paper. And if you really want to understand it, here, read this.
Mm-hmm.
This is very vulnerable. Read it. And that in itself can be empowering. In
It
that,
sounds like it was a great container for you, a place for you to really pour out what was going on and to have, the journal kind of contain some of the grief for you.
yeah. And I find that for a lot of people who are not able to verbalize it, using creative means, whether it's journaling, music, movies, things that connect them. I'm really into nature. My mother always gets really upset with me when she sees me walking barefoot all the time. Even when I was a little girl, put your shoes on. You're gonna step on something nasty. This, that, whatever, what have you. And the other day, she gave me a look, and I just smiled at her because I'm like, I'm 48 years old. When are you going to give up on that? I was
Yep.
born without shoes. I'm going to die
Yep.
without shoes.
Yep.
And I love feeling my barefoot feet on the ground. It grounds me. But I think that, everybody has something that they're connected to. And as a creative spirit, I love books. I love reading. I love talking. But then there's other times at HSP where I don't want to talk because
Mm-hmm.
it drains me, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
There's a
how,
great place for humor with the grieving process too.
absolutely.
And I think it can be really healing.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that there have been moments that people have, I have a colleague at one point who had, I don't know, I think it was a year or two ago, and I was heading to the cemetery to go visit with my son, and I don't, I don't know. I guess she didn't know much about it. And she had asked me, what happened? And I wasn't thinking of what it was that she was asking me. I was like, he's dead. That's what happened. And then after I said it and I blurted it out, I started laughing. And this woman, who's a friend of mine and a colleague, she had this mortified look on her face, like, are you serious? You just did that? And I was like, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. That just, after a while, when you process stuff, things that probably would have offended me a long time ago. Um, don't, and I find a lot of humor in things. So I'm always trying to be conscious of not laughing, but depending on where a person is processing their grief. But at the same time, I think that part of the human piece of what my clients like is that we can laugh at, it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom, um, we can have lightheartedness in the conversation, and even some dark humor sometimes
I think the
helps.
gallows humor is great sometimes. I think all forms of expression are ways that we release our feelings. And so it all needs to come out. It's just energy that needs to move through us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know that we're coming up to our hour. It feels like we just kind of started, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us how the Compassionate Connectors can connect with you or take advantage of any of your offerings.
Okay. If you are in San Diego and you're interested in working with me as a therapist, or I work with people online in California, you can check out my website. I've got some videos on it. It's patriciayounglcsw.com. I have a YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and again, just search up Patricia Young LCSW. I've got more videos on there. And then I'm going to be starting a podcast. My guess is it'll probably be out in November. I have great intentions. Sometimes my follow through things take a little bit longer, but it's going to be called Highly Sensitive, Our Stories and Strengths.
Oh.
And you'll be able to find it on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And it's going to be about you don't necessarily have to be an HSP to be on the podcast, but just exploring all kinds of things in depth.
I love that. That's on my horizon too. Someday,
Yeah.
I'm going to set the intention. I have the title. I have the podcast cover.
Wow.
I did do all that, but it just hasn't come to the fruition. But I so appreciate conversations that I can listen to while I'm on the road, that I can listen to, early in the morning when it's quiet time or what have you. So I will be one of your subscribers for
Oh, thank you.
sure. Yeah, and I want to invite you that when I put this up in the forum, please, I'll go ahead and tag you, and you can put all that connecting information in the comments so that people know exactly where to get you, and that way our tribe doesn't feel like they need to hit rewind, back up, rewind like I do with a lot of things to write down notes. I think that would be a helpful thing.
Okay. Thanks. I
So
appreciate
Patricia,
it.
I really want to say thank you for joining me in this collaboration, for sharing some of your insights and your experience, your humor, of course. I felt like I've learned so much today, and I am forever grateful to you for your time and your talent and for how you share your passion and your healing into the world. So thank you.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I love talking about this stuff. Like, this was fun. Can we do it again?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We probably will do it again.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dee Dee. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.